Over 1,400 people of all different skill levels analyzed these three positions to see what they thought the best moves were. In this video, we're going to analyze their responses and see how they match up to what Stockfish said actually were the best moves. Remember, if you want to take the exact same quiz that all these people took, there's a link in the description below. You can just click on that. There's also a link down there for next week's quiz if you want to get in early before that video comes out. And I'm also going to give you a chance to pause the video before we look at the solution to each position, so you can also just follow along that way. All right, real quick before we start, here's the rating graph that shows the number of players in each rating category. You can see we had 1,431 players participate, almost double what we had last week. Nice distribution, lots of different rating ranges participating. The most was in the 1,000 to 1,300 range like before, and then obviously 2,000 plus is going to be less. Let's look at the positions. All right, so here's position number one. Black has just played knight to g4, and it is now white's turn, white to play. If you'd like to participate, go ahead and pause the video now. For everyone else who's ready to see the solution, here we go. So if we look at 0 to 1,000, most players said queen takes d5, but then queen to d4 was a close second, and then knight f3 was number 3. And queen takes d5 is actually the correct move, and the point is you're capturing the pawn, and even though it looks like you're hanging your queen, if black takes it, you now have this really nice fork where you win your queen back, and you get another pawn in the process. So you end up getting two pawns there. Black has to move somewhere, and then you just take the queen. So that was the idea. That was kind of the little tactic that I wanted to see if people notice, and a lot of players under 1,000 actually did find it. The move queen to d4, which was number 2, is not a bad idea. It's doing a couple of things, like, you know, kind of controlling this diagonal and preventing black from putting more pressure there. So I guess maybe that was the idea. It also does defend the pawn, but it's just not as good as capturing the pawn and going for that fork. So, and then knight to f3, normally speaking, that's a pretty good move, developing, defending the pawn. But again, when there's a tactic like this available, that's what you want to try to find. So 1,000 to 1,300, 50% of players did find this move, and then we had knight f3 and also queen d4 coming in at 2 and 3. And then for the next three categories, so 13 to 16, 16 to 2,000, and 2,000 and above, this was a top move. And each group, the percentage increased a little bit, so more and more players found it, but everybody was pretty much finding that move. And then same idea, knight f3 and queen d4 were coming in at 2 and 3. And I am a little bit surprised that the over 2,000 group, there was still a couple players that missed the tactic and wanted to play knight f3 and queen d4. I was expecting pretty much everyone was going to see this at above 2,000. So that was a little bit interesting. This was the move that I wanted to play. I've seen this idea before. One of the things that I've said before is whenever there's almost a tactic, a lot of times there's a trick you can do to make it happen. And that's kind of how tactics work. If you see some sort of pattern, like, oh, that really looks close to being a good fork, what can I do to make it work? And then maybe queen takes d5 pops into your head as an idea. All right, if we look at Stockfish, queen takes d5 is indeed the best move. And interesting that h3 is actually the second best move, because it looks like it kind of just hangs this pawn. But the point is that if you play h3 and black takes the pawn, well, then you still have the same tactic available, which is why h3 is, you know, actually not that bad, because it kind of forces the knight to do something, and then you can still do the same tactic. But then after that, knight f3 was the third option. All right, here's position number 2. If you would like to pause the video and try to figure out what you would play as white, now's the time to do that. For everyone else who's ready to see the solution, here we go. All right, so for this position, I actually want to show you how we got into this position, because I think it's interesting for a lot of players to understand this. But we had a Sicilian where white castled queenside and black castled kingside. And what black ended up doing is bringing this rook over and sacrificing it on c3 for this knight to be able to take on a2. And this is how white ended up with their king in this kind of awkward position. Okay, so if you're wondering how this position happened, that's how. And this is the position where you had to figure out what move you would play. So there's a little trick here, and the trick has to do with the fact that there's a bishop sitting over here, which is lined up on d4. Okay, so if you forget about this knight for a second, you've got two pieces lined up on this bishop, which is only defended one time. And so if white is not very careful about what they play, black is simply going to capture here with check. And when the pawn takes, guess what? Well, now there's two pieces and you're losing this bishop, and then it gets real bad for white. So that was kind of the idea that I wanted to see if anybody saw. These discovered attacks are very, very dangerous, and you always want to be on the lookout for those types of moves. So in the under 1,000 category, actually the top 3 moves were not correct. So the top move was B3, and then a close second was G5, and then a few people also said E5. So let's just talk about them one at a time. B3, it's a good idea because it's attacking the queen, trying to make the queen go away. The problem, like I said, is that black can take here with check, which is also a fork, so you kind of have to just take it. And then the queen can come over here and capture this piece, and after takes, black has a lot of compensation for the exchange, right? So that they sack the rook, but now they have both bishops, lots of pawns. So white only has 5 pawns, black has 3, 6, 7. So bishop and 2 pawns, and very aggressive placement. Stockfish actually says black is quite a bit better here, and so that was the problem with b3. G5, very similar, even though it's making a threat, it doesn't prevent what black wanted to do anyway, capture here, and then after you take, the bishop or the queen, in this case Stockfish likes bishop better, the bishop can capture, and now white's even in a worse position than before. So not preventing knight takes e4 was a big problem. And then the third move, e5, actually it does prevent this threat because it blocks off the bishop. You know, so if black tries the same thing, well, now you could just take it and you're okay. The reason this move is actually not good is because now black can simply capture here, and what does this do that's so important? It opens up this d file on white's king. So like if you just recapture, guess what? This rook is coming over, and white's in big trouble. Now there's so many pieces, and yeah, Stockfish is saying minus 5.5 for black. So very, very good for black. So that's the issue with e5. So if you go to the 1,000 to 1,300 group, again, players were really not seeing good ways to stop this threat. The top move was G5, which we kind of already talked about. Second move was B3, and some players also said H5, which H5, you know, is a good idea. You're trying to kind of counterattack and open up the file for the rook. But the issue is black just has some very immediate threats that, you know, you don't really have time for this. It's a little bit slower of a plan. Now in the 13 to 1600 range, we started to see more players find a good move. Now the top moves were still G5 and B3, which were not good for the reasons we already talked about. But the third move was King to E1. And this is actually a very good move for dealing with this, because now if black captures, white just simply takes the knight. And what's the difference in this position? Well, this bishop is now defended by the rook. So there's no, you don't have to worry. If black takes this, it's just a trade now. So for those of you who found King E1 here, nice job. Now if we go to 1600 to 2000, the top move was still B3. Players were just not seeing, I don't know if they didn't see this idea at all, or if they just didn't see a good way to stop it. But B3, not really the greatest option. But then options 2 and 3, we had King E1 and King E3, which are both good for dealing with that threat for the reason that we talked about. This bishop gets defended. Above 2000, we had a tie between King E3 and B3. So no and yes, that's an okay move. And we also had some players saying Rook to E1. And Rook to E1 is actually also a good move because it defends this pawn with the rook. So if black tries the same trick, well, now you can capture with the rook, and you get the added benefit that your bishop is defended again from the rook. So this tactic revolved around understanding the best way to defend your bishop because it was in danger, even though it kind of didn't look like it. So when I looked at this position, I said King E3. I did notice this attack here and this threat, but I was pretty concerned that, like, regardless of what I did, this rook was coming over, and it looked very dangerous, and I didn't want my king to get stuck back here and potentially mated, so I thought at least King E3, I have the ability to run to more places, it seemed like, and I was also kind of defending some central squares. I thought maybe I could block things off here with this bishop. So I just felt like King E3 maybe was a better square, but honestly, I wasn't sure in this position how this was going to turn out for white. And if we look at Stockfish, it really didn't mind between all 3 of these moves that we kind of talked about. They were all good for the reasons we talked about. As long as you dealt with that threat, Stockfish was pretty happy. All right, here's position number 3. It's white to play. If you would like to pause the video and see if you can figure out what you would play as white, now's the time. And for everyone else who's ready to see the solution, here we go. All right, so this was a tough position for a lot of people. And the reason it's so tricky is because, first of all, you've got the checkmate threat here on h2, which I think most people saw. It's defended by your knight, but your knight's about to get captured by this pawn. So a lot of players were wanted to play the move knight to e5. to save the knight and block the queen. The problem is that queen to h6 can happen, and now you've got two checkmate threats, and you can't deal with both of them. The best you could do would be like knight takes here, which prevents one, but then you get mated on h1. So that was the problem with knight to e5. Now that being said, it's not really easy to find another solution. Even if you weren't going to play knight e5, like what are you going to play, right? This is still a very real threat regardless, or this. So one of the things to know about this position is you've got 4 pieces and black only has 2. So black had to sacrifice 2 pieces to get into this position. So even if you gave up one of those pieces, you could still come out on top. So that's one thing to kind of keep in mind. So first, let's go ahead and look at what did the players under 1,000. So knight to e5 was the top move, which we kind of talked about why that's no good. Queen h6, and you get mated. And the next move was bishop to b4, and it's not a bad idea. You're trying to counterattack something, which makes sense. But again, after queen h6, same issue, right? You can't stop both of these threats. And then the third most common move in the under 1,000, king to g2, is actually the correct move. So if you found that, congratulations. The reason this is the correct move is, even though it looks pretty bad, right? Because you're letting black capture with check, and now this is a threat. Like if you take with the queen, you just get mated in 1. The reason it's okay is because you can take with the king, and even though it looks like you're bringing your king out to the open, you've got this place to run to over here on e2. And black has no good ways to really attack your king. Like rook here, check, doesn't really do anything. You just run back here, and you've got lots of options. You can move this bishop and keep running with your king if you want. You could push this pawn to control, block off this diagonal, block with the rook, and you've got lots of good options here, and you're fine. So that's the idea behind king to g2. You give back one piece, but then your king ends up getting safe over here. And the other part of this move is that after queen to h6, you also have a way to save the position. So here's kind of a bonus puzzle if you want to pause the video if you haven't already thought about this. How do you save the position now from this position as white? Well, this one was actually pretty tough. The solution is knight to h4, which, yes, you're just giving away the knight for free. The point is that after that, you can now play rook to h1, and your rook is controlling all of these squares, and you've got it defended by the queen, so if black tries to take you, it's just a big trade. Now, some people are probably thinking, well, why did you have to move your knight there? Why don't you just go rook h1 immediately? And the reason is because if you go rook h1 now, well, black is able to capture the knight with check, and not only do you lose the knight anyway, but now you have to either move your king, so like take this, let's say, which leaves your rook undefended. Now black can take it. Or same thing here, rook's undefended, black takes it. Or if you capture this pawn with the queen, again, rook's undefended because the queen is no longer defending it, and so now black takes it. Or the only other thing that you could do is move your king back here or here, in which case you just get checkmated. So there's no good moves regardless, and so that's why it was important to move here first, force black to capture it, and then now you're safe to play rook h1, and you know there's no pawn to capture here to put you in that bad position. So I hope that made sense. This was much more of a difficult puzzle, very tricky to see some of these lines, but king g2 was indeed the correct move. All right, so with the 1000 to 1300, basically had the same 3 moves, just different order. 13 to 1600, we had knight e5, king g2, and then e4. Now, e4 is an interesting move because e4 actually has a very important purpose of unleashing this bishop, which takes away this h6 square. So if you remember, one of the most dangerous things that black has been doing in this position is moving the queen over to h6 and then coming down here and checkmating us, right? So by playing e4, that's not an option. Now, you do still have the problem that your knight's going to get captured. But another important thing about e4 is that after that happens, you can also play e5. And what e5 does that's so important is block off this diagonal. So essentially, black had 2 major threats. Number 1 was coming down here, checkmate. Number 2 was coming over here and then down here, checkmate. And by playing e5, you know, now you have stopped both of those, right? That's not an option, and that's not an option. So really nice idea if anyone found this. I'll go ahead and tell you, this was my idea when I looked at this position. I actually didn't realize King G2 was as good as it was. I thought E4 and then E5 was my plan. E4 is not a bad move. We'll get to Stockfish's evaluation in just a second. But yeah, congrats if you came up with that nice solution there. And in 1600 to 2000, we had the same moves. So 95, then E4, and then King G2 were the three moves. 2000 and above, top move was E4, and then 95, and then King G2. So some players are finding the right move, but a lot of players were really thrown off by this Knight E5 move. And then if we check Stockfish, the only two good moves, with King G2 being the best, but the only two were King G2 and E4. So we kind of talked about those already. Those were two ways to get out of the jam here. And then it's showing Bishop H7 as the next best move, which is obviously not a good move. It just loses the bishop, but at least it kind of delays everything by one move. But basically, those are the only two ways to get out of this position. All right, now we'll end the video with viewers versus Stockfish. If you're new here and don't know what that is, that's just where we compare the moves that everybody suggested and see what percentage of players guessed Stockfish's move. So if we go to position number 1, across all different rating ranges, the number of players who matched up with Stockfish's move of queen takes d5, 53.9%. So really good job. If you don't know the rules to this competition, we tried to get over 50%. And if we do that across all three positions on average, we consider that a win. So we are winning right now. But let's go on to position number 2. And unfortunately, we did not do well at all here. Only 8.7% of players found, one of these decent moves to kind of deal with this tactic. So that's not good. That brings the average way down. If you go to position number 3, just 25% of players matching up with one of these two good moves that Stockfish said. So pretty rough match as far as viewers versus Stockfish goes. Final score was just 29.4%. All right, so I'll bring my spreadsheet over and you can see this was today's match. We lost 29.4%, but I picked 50% as the threshold for victory just because I felt like it would be a challenge and give people something to kind of work at and try to get better as we continue to do these things. So don't really worry so much about that. Hopefully this is a learning experience for you. That's kind of the whole point behind this. Let me know if you have questions, comments, things that you think will make this better or more interesting or more fun. Let me know, and I will see you guys in next week's quiz. Thanks a lot. Take care.